we have been, chatting quite a bit about a new book that he had just put out called Market Crafters. He's done some fantastic work talking about the future of the U.S. economy. He's the chair of the Economic Security Project. We had just, had Shafika Hashash on a few weeks ago talking about some of that great work there too. But Chris, very excited to have you join us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so I know there is a ton of ground for us to cover as we're, thinking about talking about what is in store for the future of the U.S. economy. So one of the, big issues on people's minds right now is the Federal Reserve meeting that is going to be starting tomorrow. I have previously worked at the Federal Reserve. You have done a ton of coverage of the Federal Reserve. We're able to cover some really, fascinating stories kind of in the book. Yeah, I would love, to hear your thoughts about what is going on with the Federal Reserve these days. It is a very tumultuous, time for this fantastic organization.
Well, tumultuous, I think, is an understatement. So, I think that there's a lot of talk about central banking and the Fed in the world. It happens in the pages of the Wall Street Journal. It happens on Wall Street, but it also happens amongst small business owners and workers. And that's because the decisions of the central bank around monetary policy and financial regulation really matter. When credit tightens, it means that their jobs are at risk. And when the economy is fragile and at risk of heading into a recession and credit loosens, it means that people can keep their jobs. So the Fed's decisions might seem, well, they are technical and it is a technocratic kind of institution, but they have real world consequences, which I think matter quite a bit. So this week, the Fed is meeting, and it's meeting in a period of extreme instability and duress. The president has threatened the insulated nature of the institution in a way that's historically unprecedented. Congress has specifically made the Fed insulated from the presidency and from the ups and downs of the political cycle. And Trump doesn't like that. He wants the Fed to kneel. And that conflict, I'm sure we can talk more about. So in that moment that we're living in, the Fed has to make a tough decision. The economy seems to be growing weaker by the week. However, inflation is still elevated. So most people expect a quarter point reduction, which will be the first of the year. I expect that too. And then the big question is, do they keep going over the months to come and continue to loosen, or do they hold? We'll see.
Yeah, yeah, I think, I'd seen something that it's, the market has a 93%, prediction, that, there will, kind of be this rate change. But I know that there's, a ton of, pressure as well, from people who are, from the administration and, in this balance of, policy versus, politics,
Yeah.
that, we, so often experience and that the Fed has, folks have been, for so long tried to insulate it from. One thing you and I had talked about a few weeks ago was sort of this, yeah, the, balancing or tension that can sometimes happen between policy and politics, right? Where
Hmm.
sometimes you have, the greatest idea in the world, or you, have created this institution that you think, is really able to, bring great force to the U.S. economy. But when it comes up against the challenges of political will, it can be really difficult for folks to navigate. So, can you talk a bit about, how you have kind of thought about how folks can manage this, policy versus politics tension that sometimes occurs?
Yeah, listen, this is a long-standing dynamic, not just in relation to the central bank, but across the different parts of the government. There are some administrative agencies and some institutions in the government that Congress wants to be more independent from the ups and downs of the political cycle. And for this reason, Congress has said that the president cannot remove the people who run these institutions except for cause, which, mostly means egregious kind of behavior on the job that um, rises to a level of that would justify their removal. And so, and with the Fed in particular, we have never seen a governor or a Reserve Bank president removed for cause. we've seen all kinds of pressure from the White House here and there in the early 50s. There was an important moment with Thomas McCabe in the 1960s. President Lyndon Johnson summons the chair, Bill Martin, down to his ranch and forces him to take a ride and over the prairies, and physically sort of intimidates Martin to try to push him to lower rates. He even goes so far as to nominate the first black governor of the Federal Reserve, partially because he wanted to make history, but partially because he knew that Martin couldn't, or it would be very difficult for Martin to resist
Mm,
that effort. And Johnson believed that would get him looser monetary policy. So there have been all kinds of moments of real pressure and sort of political jockeying around the institution. But there's never been a president who's tried to do something illegal, and
yeah,
it is clearly illegal, which is remove a governor for cause. And of course, in the example of Lisa Cook, it's like a story out of the mafia or something. One of the president's uh, uh, henchmen, who runs the FHFSA, found these documents that they claim that Cook did not fill out correctly, and thus, they assume malintent and fraud. They've spun this whole story together to suggest that she be removed. And the irony is that Lisa Cook wants looser monetary policy.
right,
She wants what the president wants, and the more that the president applies this pressure on the institution, I think the more that markets will particularly bond markets, will react, and the cost, which is the cost the government has to pay, will go up. So it doesn't make much rational sense, but there's a lot of stuff that this administration does that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
that that is very true. And I think one of the things that you do fantastically in the book, and I think is a really helpful way to sort of understand the U.S. economy, is through this role of characters and these folks who these market crafters, these people who actually take a big influence on the economy, and these stories of riding across the prairie and the influence, like those are the things that end up having a much bigger effect on the economy and rates and things than people traditionally realize. We have this belief that the market is controlled by the free hand, but it's actually
Yeah,
controlled by how close LBJ is talking to your face at any given moment, and that intimidation that he's able to have on you.
yeah.
I
And
know,
that's why I think the history of central banking, just a quick comment on that, is so important, is because we do tell ourselves a story of like free financial markets. The idea is that they work according to their own logic. But in reality, the central bank guides those markets, tightening and loosening credit, responding to what's happening, and effectively sets the price of short-term credit, price setting from a government institution in order to provide price stability and maximum employment. And so if that's not a crafted, shaped, and managed market, I don't know what is.
right? One of these, characters who I particularly love from the book was, we talked about this a bit before too, was around energy policy and Bill
Mhm.
Simon. And I know, when you were on Stewart, I believe a few weeks ago or maybe a few months ago now, um, you had some colorful language to talk about Bill Simon. So can you
Yeah.
talk a bit about Bill and 1973 OPEC oil crisis and kind of the energy crises of the 70s and sort of how that
Yeah.
ended up shaping a lot of U.S. energy policy?
Yeah, I got to go back and watch that Daily Show episode to see if they
It's
bleeped out. My parents. I grew up in the rural South in a very polite family, and my parents would grimace if they knew I was saying unkind things on television about anybody. So Bill Simon, um, this guy's a fascinating character because he effectively managed the first energy crisis in the early 1970s, keeping gas prices relatively stable and preventing shortages. And in the book, I contrast that management with what happened in the second oil crisis of that decade, which was chaos, decontrolled prices, shortages, lines, all the things that many people remember as being a kind of nightmare
yeah,
scenario for many Americans. And so, um, the irony is that Simon himself became an avowed libertarian. He really did not believe in government as a force to solve people's problems or manage the economy.
Mm,
And so, as a character in the book, he was one of the most difficult to write about personally, because like going through his correspondence and stuff, I just really didn't like it. He just was not kind of person that I would be friends with. But more importantly, how does a libertarian effectively use government to craft a market? And that was the question that I, in my own
right,
research, had to, navigate through. And what I learned about him and about others is that there are a good number of times where people use a rhetoric of self-regulating markets, and in reality are happy, particularly when they're in power, to bring government to bear to provide stability, order, and some operational framework to those markets. That tends to be the language that they use. It's less about redistribution or fairness or that kind of thing, and it's more about how do we make sure that the markets are orderly and well functioning? But that requires a lot of crafting and a lot of
right.
management. So in Bill Simon's case, what happened is in the oil crisis, the prices were skyrocketing, and Nixon and Simon, who at the time was Deputy Treasury Secretary, had to figure out how are we going to stabilize prices, prevent shortages, and make sure that hospitals, the military, um, even New Englanders who heated their home with home heating oil had essential amounts of energy products to prevent deaths, to prevent the kind of real deep suffering that many believe that we were at risk for. And so, what Simon did is he used tactical price controls to bring up the prices gradually. He made decisions around allocation by region, by hospital, by different kind of
Yeah,
outlets. He ensured that home heating oil was in abundant supply. He got lucky at the beginning of the winter because it was a little warm, and then when some of the lines did start cropping up, he began to release what had been saved into the market. And so the upshot is, there outside of a couple weeks in February, there weren't widespread shortages. The prices did increase by 20 to 30%, a lot, but a lot less than they did in
right.
other developed countries, and a lot less than what happened at the end of the decade, where Jimmy Carter decontrolled prices, told everybody to put on an extra sweater, and said, and turned down the heat in the White House and said everybody else should do the same, and then um, let the market just do its thing. And there we had profound problems. So Simon was just a fascinating and difficult character to write about, but I think one of the most instructive.
Yeah, are you seeing some of that, now in, the big conversation that I'm often hearing, around energy is in particular, for so many of these, giant AI data centers,
Yeah.
hyperscalers that are, increasing the price of energy. You'll have a giant data center outside of somebody's home, and all of a sudden all of their, water disappears or their price of electricity goes up. Um, and what do we do for those market crafters who we need now, who can try and help us set or respond to some of these new crises that we're seeing? Is there anyone who is guiding that now, or do you see this as a totally separate type of challenge that we had kind of gone through you know a half century ago?
I think energy production is one of the core challenges for the American economy to get right, because it certainly is a topic du jour because of the AI investments that you mentioned. But for me, I tend to think about it through the prism of climate change as well, and the urgent need to find and support renewable sources of energy. And then just from like a human perspective, the energy prices have been going up significantly globally, really since the Ukrainian invasion, and here in the United States are going up quite fast in this period for a lot of different factors. The AI usage is one contributing factor, but not the only one. So
Right.
the short answer to your question is I think we do need an energy minded market craft of the future. And I think that the first step in that has to be a clear goal of increased energy production. But I think it has to be from clean and renewable sources. And in my view, market craft is most successful when you have a clear mission, and then you have an institution that is charged with the power of accomplishing that. So, if we're talking about big picture, how could we do that? I think we do need significantly more public investment. So the Biden administration started this with in the climate bill, the
Right.
IRA, which the amount that was invested in clean energy doubled from the beginning of the Biden administration to the second. So we made real progress, and even though it's slowing, the overall amount may still be going up, but the rate of increase is slowing. It's still significantly higher than it was before, but we have to have more, significantly more public investment and private investment in those sources of energy. And I do think that there's a lot that needs to happen with cross-border, interstate energy markets, with permitting, with electrical lines. This has been in the news for years, but I think that a smart market craft would make it easier for energy production to move across state lines to meet a lot of the climate change goals that we have.
I am very aligned with you, Chris. I think you and I share a lot of, similar thoughts about the economy. We definitely share, similar views around, the value of cash and guaranteed income. And I also share this view about we do need market crafters now who can steer us, in that direction. But I don't know how optimistic I feel about that we have those, kind of people in certain roles that we are empowering our institutions right now to do that.
Oh God,
Bidenomics
yeah.
very much so, did that, but I don't get the sense that Trumponomics is really orienting us towards that. I know in the book you talk a bit more about some of our more, recent characters in official roles who are helping to guide this. Like, how do you see us, continuing to shape those things, given that we are maybe, disempowering many of those organizations or those leaders at the same time? Like, do we need to take a, 4-year hiatus on this, or are there other ways that we can still achieve the same goals?
Well, I think that the bad news is that the economic agenda of this administration, ironically, for a president who campaigned on the cost of living, is uh, I think he's got other priorities, other fish to fry, and the cost of living is going up precipitously
Yeah.
with energy costs, but elsewhere. And so I think Trumponomics is a disaster, to be direct about it. Why in the world, when Americans are struggling with housing, healthcare, childcare, food prices continue to be elevated, would you put on across the board tariffs upwards of 20%?
Right.
So raise the costs of construction materials, let alone the food that we all buy in the grocery store, when people are saying, no, no, we need prices to at least be stable, if not come down. There is no comprehensive plan for housing. It's not something that interests these folks, and yet it is a surging cost of. Anyway, so I think that the Trump agenda is economically is the kind of thing that where they're giving tax breaks to billionaires and Trump's friends, and at the cost of healthcare and many of the other things that Americans care about. So, what do we do? For those of us who believe that market craft is important and should be needed for climate and for a whole host of other things, I think we have to. Um, resist the efforts of the Trump administration at every point possible. I think we have to develop an agenda that is clear. What would we do if we had power today to bring down energy prices and make it more abundant? I think we need to be able to answer that question in a big heady sort of think tank policy and plans kind
Sure.
of way. And then our political leaders need to be able to cut through the complexity and speak clearly about what the plan is. And unfortunately, I think a lot of Americans feel like Democrats don't have a plan on a lot of these issues. and need one. And so I think that's the most urgent thing that we can all be doing, which is contributing to the ideas generation itself, and then helping uh, uh, refine and improve how we explain what the agenda might be.
Yeah, and I think what also, gives me continued hope about this is that it isn't, only and always, the folks who are in, Congress, who are the elected officials who can be really, driving a lot of that change. It comes up so much in, Mark Dunkelman's book as well, Why
Hmm.
Nothing Works, about, these other, powerful figures who could help, bring about change through agencies. Like, I think a lot about, Jesse Jones and, sort of the work that he had done, during the New Deal, under FDR, to also bring about change and think about housing as well. And so I also like to kind of continue to boil that down even further to think about, right, so much of American inequality is what happens in communities at the local level, right? So much of this challenges and we think about as this big national challenge, but opportunity and inequality really starts to emerge in communities. And who are those local leaders, whether that can be, you or your neighbor or your coalition, that you start, creating some of those, changes, can really make a big difference.
It really can,
I want to talk a bit.
and just
Yeah.
just one other thing on that. Last week, I was talking with someone. His name is Graham Plattner. He's running for Senate, U.S. Senate, from Maine, and he is an oysterman in Maine who lives a very working class life. He was in the military for a decade, and hearing him speak about his own frustration and feeling unrepresented and unheard um, was really moving to me. He's that kind of person who, like 3 months ago, was not running for
Yeah.
elected office and was just trying
Oh,
to
wow.
make ends meet, and now he's there, putting himself out there, which is risky, which is hard in this moment to do it. And there is something about seeing him, stand up and put a lot on the line that I found very inspiring. But I think he's just a crisp example of like what a person who may not look and fit the mold, I guess, of what you might expect as a politician. Um, when they get frustrated enough, they can stand up and say enough and put themselves out there. And so I don't know, I just
I
found it
feel
very
like a
inspiring.
oyster farm is, often had to like crack a hard problem or something. Like there's probably some metaphor for
There's a
him.
metaphor in there somewhere
He's
for
got
sure.
working for him. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about competition and the FTC and
yeah.
Lena Khan in particular, because there is a really, I don't know, evolving, kind of literature around the role of, competition and inequality, and how industry, consolidation can really be a challenge for workers. It makes it much more difficult for them to bargain for wages, to get benefits. We have seen really the decline of unions, right? In 1950, 1 in 3 workers was in a union. Today, it's 1 in 10. And this, challenge, right, that you sometimes hear of, consolidation can be really challenging for workers and bargaining power. But at the same time, is going to, back and forth research on like, take a Walmart, for example, and then the value of its really low prices, in a community, and that only when you have these, really strong institutions can they really, create all these consumer benefits for folks.
Hmm.
You've thought quite a bit about, these types of challenges. So can you talk a bit about competition policy, the FTC, what's going on with
Yeah.
Andrew Ferguson now, and things like that?
Hmm. Yeah, I think you're putting your finger right on it. I think Americans have an almost innate antipathy to big corporations. I do personally, and I
Yeah.
think I grew up in rural North Carolina, and a lot of people I grew up with had that. I think, but a lot of people in urban areas, sort of across races, across demographics, across geographies, people really don't like big corporations, and I think it's for a few reasons. They feel like they're, lecherous, sometimes extracting a lot of value, and that they have this outsized power that eclipses it. Now, on the other side of that, we also most Americans want open competitive markets, believe that competition is an engine. I've certainly believed that competition is an engine of innovation,
Right.
and a kind of managed capitalism is the way that we can build widely shared prosperity and help people live the lives that they want to live. So how do we like live with these two things at the same time? And my view is that um, we have to ensure that markets are actually open and fair. That competition is it's sort of like you can compare it to a sporting analogy. You to have a good game, you want teams that are roughly even. You want there to be clear rules. When do we start and when do we end? And we want those rules to be evenly enforced. And then may the best folks win. And I think it's the same idea in our markets. So what happens is when markets become too concentrated and you get either a monopoly where you have one single big company dominating the market, or an oligopoly where you have a few very large companies dominating the market, you do see real quantifiable negative effects. So it's
Right.
not just that Americans don't like this, it's that we see that it's quite bad for us. You see um, wages can be suppressed because there's less competition, as you were highlighting. If there's only one employer in town, then it's Walmart, then it's not competing for wages. That's the kind of monopsony powers, is what we call it. We see lower rates of productivity and innovation. And maybe most importantly, you see pricing power. You see companies able to raise prices for customers. And there's a lot of empirical evidence that shows that concentration has gotten very bad in America, and that we're paying for it. So antitrust and antitrust enforcement, I think, is critical if we want to have an economy that's fair and competitive. We've had a resurgence of interest in this over the last few years. Lena Khan got an enormous amount of attention. She has been at the forefront of leading not just the resurgence of interest, but a kind of reinvigoration of antitrust policy and antitrust enforcement. And there's a lot of differences on the left and the right, but I think it is also true that on the right there is um, uh, uh, a different enthusiasm for the set of issues as well. Andrew
Yeah.
Ferguson, who you mentioned, leads the Federal Trade Commission now, and who has kept a lot of the guidelines that Lena's Federal Trade Commission wrote. He's continued the case against Meta and some of these other cases, for instance, which signals, listen, there's still he's also agreed that the Democratic commissioner should be able to be fired by the president. So I disagree with this guy
Yeah.
on a lot of stuff. However, there is some through line on
Right.
antitrust enforcement that I think matters and is indicative of a kind of paradigm shift on the issue.
But do you think though that, I know some folks were even like surprised by the, Andrew Ferguson pick, and that sort of seemed a bit,
Mhm.
more in line with, Lena Khan, and kind of like, in this, pushing back, against the consolidation, right? But I think to your earlier points, like, how do we think about this goal of, this administration in the, trying to increase competition? Like, was that his goal, or do you think it was some of this other part of trying to think about how we could, raise wages for those, workers who might be most negatively impacted from this? Or was it just, Trump giving out favors to friends, and we shouldn't look too deeply into it?
Yeah, well, I think that there's a tension, right? I think we're seeing something close to kleptocracy in the White House, where Trump is trying to govern from one deal to the next. He'll relax export controls on Nvidia if they'll give the government a kickback. I mean, it's kind of very unprecedented and bizarre behavior, which is not good for investors, by the way, because you don't have any
Right.
certainty. You can't predict the future. So I think that's very real. I think that some of these folks at the Federal Trade Commission, at the Department of Justice, at some of these other places that share the antitrust authority, I'm not sure that they. I think some of them are people of integrity who believe that we need a more robust enforcement. But it is very, very hard to tell when you're working and supporting an administration where there is so much, uh, where the rule of law is often just cast aside. It's hard to look to the lawyers who are supposed to be enforcing the law, and yet
Right.
who are, serving the pleasure of this president, and so it's hard to trust them. At the end of the day, I think that there is a suspicion of corporate power, and that is the thing that binds a lot of these folks together. That causes some of them to be interested in using the antitrust laws as a way to manage corporate power, and that is different than I think Trump himself's approach. And so there's a real live tension there. But I do think it's worthwhile to say that is a very different Republican Party than the one that I grew up with, or even the one that we saw 10 years ago, where in general there was deference to free markets, self regulating markets, corporations, banks believing that they'd often find the way to the right answer. I think the story has gotten a lot more complex since then.
Very much so. Um, every American inequality article ends with this, path forward section, right? We talk about, all of these, various challenges occurring in the U.S. from housing to healthcare to education to, competition and workers' wages, but trying to end on this note of there are things that we can do. And, we talked a little bit about, the power of organizing and getting people in your community together. Are there any notes that you have, about, whether it's these, lessons you learned from these, 12 folks that you profiled, or things that you were like, we must focus on this going forward? Anything where you're like, this is really how we can continue to focus on, improving, opportunity for folks, for shaping the market in ways that, will help folks get closest, to the American dream?
I think if the book Market Crafters is an argument for anything, it's an argument that government can be effective if we get the structure right. And that is not an argument that a lot of people like to hear. My book came out at roughly the same time as the Abundance book, and I like the Abundance book. I agree with much of what it argues. And ultimately, it's sort of suggesting that government is still in the way, that the problem, it's blocking our route to prosperity through all these regulations that we need to streamline. In some cases, that is true. And I think if we want to solve the biggest problems of our time, housing, climate, how to just make ends meet, how to have affordable groceries and a living wage, then we have to have an effective government. We can't give up on these institutions, and we have to think about what has made government work in the
Right.
past. And so Market Crafters is a story of, there are failures in there too, for sure, but it's a collection of stories of when government actually works to deliver for people. What are the ingredients? And I see these three: a clear mission, an institution that has the power to deliver on that mission, to pursue that mission, the freedom, the discretion to get things done. And then thirdly, accountability. You have to
Mm,
have someone whose job it is to ensure that housing prices are coming down if you actually want housing prices to come down, because that
right.
person, their job, their reputation, their livelihoods will depend on it. And so I see that structure again and again throughout history. And so I think we need to think carefully about what has worked as we think about what might work in the future.
Yeah, no, I am similarly a big believer in the power of, government for, addressing, many of our biggest challenges. And in some ways you need that, really, systems approach to deal with, some of these really overarching challenges. And yeah, it isn't this 0-1 of, government or no government or regulation or no regulation
Yeah.
for so many of these challenges. And yes, there are certain things that can create barriers or red tape, for achieving the goals that we want. But I think it's exactly as you say, it's doing so in an effective way, about communicating those goals, about creating accountability, about empowering institutions instead of saying like, well, government is bad, only because you took the wings off the airplane, and so had never had a chance to fly. And so
Right.
thinking about the ways that we can create those set up such that we create opportunity for folks is really important.
Yeah, we got to make it work better. Like, what do we
Yeah.
if we want our lives to be better, government's not going to disappear. We got to make sure it works.
Yeah, and we are, I think there are so many people who are, pushing forward the envelope on trying to make it better. But yeah, I do agree with you right now that, we are not getting that, strength from the top and trying to make government work for the people. We are doing so many things that are making it much more difficult for people to, afford their homes, their groceries, their
Yeah.
education, their childcare. So Chris, I am so grateful for the time today. It is a fantastic book. I'm grateful for the work of, the Economic Security Project as well. And I think we all have a little bit of homework to go also watch your interview on Jon Stewart again and see if you did end up cursing on live TV. So
Right. Well, nice to see you. Thank you for having me.
yeah, talk again soon, Chris. Have a good one.
All right. See you. Bye
Bye.
bye.